Okay, let's go ahead and call this meeting, April 18th meeting of Charlottesville City Council to order. Ms. Thomas, you take the call of the roll.
Councilor Madill? Here. Councilor Payne?
Here.
Councilor Pinkston?
Here.
Mayor Snook?
Here.
And Vice Mayor Wade will not be here.
Okay. So, first of all, is there a motion to approve or to amend the agenda?
I move that we approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes. This meeting this time will be divided into two main sections. First, a work session to hear and discuss a few presentations, then a City Council business meeting which will begin around 6:30 with limited in-person public seating. We do not anticipate a reason for a closed session today, so often we will make sure that we adjourn the first session by 5:30 so that we can get into the closed session. We don't need to do that today. First item on the agenda is a UVA law class presentation on tax relief. We have UVA law professor Andy Block and/or law students Scott Chamberlain and Maggie Woodward to present. And let me just preface this a little bit by saying that Professor Block had contacted me a few months ago asking if his clinic could be of assistance to the city in some way. And this is at a time when we were really starting to grapple with the question of whether we could do more on tax relief in various forms and feeling constrained by the state laws. And so I asked them to do a deep dive on this to try to figure out what we could and couldn't do, whether there were any limitations or whether there were things that we were feeling were limitations that weren't really limitations. And with that, I turned the project over to the law school class and said, please educate us. Fire away, folks.
David, would you mind giving me sharing permission again? It seems like it's been disabled, and I can share the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maggie Woodward, and I am a law student at the University of Virginia School of Law.
And my name is Scott Chamberlain, and I'm a second-year law student at UVA Law.
So this year, as the mayor mentioned, we are both students in the law school's state and local government policy clinic under the supervision of our professor, Andy Block, who's also here with us today. Through the clinic, students provide research and analysis to state lawmakers as well as local governments in Virginia. For this project, Scott and I were charged with looking at Charlottesville's current property tax relief programs and exploring if there were any untapped ways for the city to offer more relief. Before we go any further, I'm going to read you this disclaimer that we include before all of our presentations. The ideas and recommendations expressed in this presentation are not those of the University of Virginia or the University of Virginia School of Law. They are those of the authors of this presentation alone. So with that out of the way, here's a quick summary of what we plan to discuss this afternoon. We're going to give you a brief overview of the legal authorities that Charlottesville can draw on to help residents struggling with their property tax burden. Then we're going to quickly summarize Charlottesville's current programs. We'll offer our recommendations for actions that the city could choose to take. And finally, we're going to have some time for your questions.
Thanks, Maggie. So as Maggie and the mayor mentioned, we were tasked with examining all of Charlottesville's current tax relief programming to ensure that there was no stone left unturned in terms of additional property tax exemption options. So to do that, we started by examining the authorities that both restrict and empower Charlottesville, including the state constitution, the state code, and the city charter. And we reviewed each of these authorities in consultation with experts in state and local government and read through each of these independently. So we'll now turn to Virginia's legal scheme governing a locality's ability to grant property tax exemptions, as well as local authority to create additional types of relief. So the state constitution governs all statewide and local tax action and expressly forbids any property tax exemptions aside from those for the elderly or disabled. And it explicitly prevents the General Assembly from expanding on that list of exemptions. The Virginia State Code adds some additional restrictions to the exemptions for the elderly and disabled, but as of 2011, the maximum income and net worth limitations that were set in the state code have been repealed, and now localities can set their own.
There's another statewide statute that's helpful for localities that want to provide assistance to their residents, and that's the social services title. Specifically, Section 62.3-314 gives localities the ability to make grants to their local board of social services. The local board, in turn, can create grant programs for the purpose of aiding needy residents. It's then the responsibility of the local board to administer the program and to set eligibility criteria. Really notably here, the board is not tied to the same eligibility criteria that are established for statewide assistance programs. Instead, the local board has a lot of discretion here to raise or change program criteria. It's also important to remember the special powers that Charlottesville has under its city charter. Section 50.7 of the city charter gives the city some special powers related to housing and community development that go beyond what's authorized by the Virginia Code. Specifically, the charter empowers Charlottesville to do 3 things. First, the city can make grants to low and moderate income households, which I've abbreviated here as LMI, and those grants can be used to purchase land or a dwelling. Second, the city can offer property tax exemptions to LMI households. And third, the city can make grants to LMI households to subsidize their rental payments. It's important to note that for all 3 of these powers, the charter requires the city to follow the guidelines from the Virginia Housing Development Authority, the VHDA, when they're defining who qualifies as low and moderate income persons. And we'll circle back to that restriction in just a minute.
So the programs on this slide are not overseen by Charlottesville, but they are currently existing statewide programs that any homeowner in Charlottesville could benefit from if they met the eligibility requirements. So first, the Housing Opportunity Credit is a new credit available for landlords who are renting out low-income housing. And second, the Livable Home Credit is available for any homeowners who have recently outfitted or purchased an accessible home. Lastly, the Communities of Opportunities Tax Credit is a credit that Charlottesville residents are not currently eligible for, but they could be if the state code was modified slightly to include Charlottesville in the list of eligible localities. And we'll discuss that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. As a brief refresher for council members, we're going to discuss the programs that Charlottesville currently offers before we outline the additional programming that we think Charlottesville can implement. So first, real estate tax relief, or RETR, is an exemption for elderly and disabled homeowners. Second, CHAP, or the Charlottesville Housing Affordability Program, is grants to low and moderate income homeowners who do not qualify for RETR. And lastly, rental relief is grants to low and moderate income elderly or disabled tenants specifically who bear an extraordinary burden. And now that I've talked a little bit about what Charlottesville does offer, we're just going to explicitly discuss what Charlottesville does not offer before we move on to our recommendations. So while Charlottesville does offer exemptions and grants, it does not offer any deferral programs. It also does not offer rent relief to any tenants besides the elderly and disabled that I just mentioned.
So now we want to share with you the opportunities that we've identified for Charlottesville to provide additional relief to residents. We have 5 short-term ideas the city could implement with the authority that it already has, and we have 1 medium-term proposal and 1 long-term proposal, and each of those would require change at the state level. These are opportunities that we see based on the city's legal authority, but we recognize that any decision regarding taxes and revenues is a complicated one with a lot of factors at play. It is, of course, up to the city to judge the wisdom of these proposals and to choose if there are any that you're interested in pursuing. Beginning with those short-term recommendations, our first is that the city could change the eligibility criteria for the programs that it currently offers. Starting with income, all 3 of Charlottesville's programs have income limits that are lower than they could be. In fact, there's only one program, which is the rental relief program, that's subject to a statutory limitation, and that's that VHDA income guideline for the city of Charlottesville that I mentioned earlier. On this slide, we're showing you the current limits for Charlottesville's programs, which are each around $55,000 per year. And that VHDA guideline is highlighted in blue, and it's much higher. It's $90,000 per year for a 1 or 2 person household and $105,000 per year for a household with 3 or more people. To lay it out program by program, for RETR, we believe that that $55,000 cap is likely a holdover from when the state code set limits on income and net worth of elderly and disabled people receiving property tax exemption. Those limits, like Scott told you, they were repealed in 2011. And now localities have discretion to set their own limits. In our memo, we've appended a helpful table from UVA's Weldon Cooper Center, and that shows the limits that other localities put on their programs that are similar to RETR. And that can help you gauge how Charlottesville stacks up against other localities in Virginia. Similarly, for CHAP, if the city operates CHAP under the social services provision that I highlighted earlier, then the board has discretion to raise the income limits. And as we showed you a moment ago, there's a lot of room to raise the limit on rental relief up to that VHDA guideline. Alternatively, the city could operate rental relief through the Board of Social Services under that same provision, and then the board would have discretion to raise income limits, and the program would no longer be subject to the VHDA guideline. When changing program criteria, the city could choose to keep things pretty harmonized across the programs like they are now, or you could try to tailor them more specifically to the populations that each program serves. Moving beyond the income criteria, there are other program eligibility requirements that the city could choose to change to try to serve more residents. The city could choose to eliminate the home value limitation on the CHAP program. Right now, a homeowner can only qualify for CHAP if the assessed value of their home was at or below $375,000. We think that the city might have imposed this limit to be in line with the VHD guidelines, but those guidelines aren't required to be used for programs operating under the social services provision that we highlighted. In administering the CHAP program, Board of Social Services could choose to raise or eliminate that home price limitation. Finally, the city could choose to expand rental relief. Right now, rental relief serves elderly and disabled renters, but the city charter gives Charlottesville the authority to make grants to low and moderate income individuals as well. Alternatively, the city could use its social services powers to administer the rental relief program. And then, like CHAP, the limits would be fully at the discretion of the local board. Moving on to our second recommendation. So this one also involves a change to an existing program, but for a little bit different reason. Applicants for the RETR program cannot have a net worth of more than $125,000. Rental relief has a similar limit, but the CHAP program does not. And when we spoke with the city's Commissioner of the Revenue for our research, he pointed out that the net worth provision is administratively difficult. It's time consuming for city staff to go through the proper documentation with residents, and some residents find it confusing to know what documentation they need to provide. Plus, there are some fairness concerns here. Imposing the limit on RETR but not on homeowners who are trying to qualify through CHAP, just raises some issues of equity. Like the income limit on RETR, we think that this net worth limit is a legacy from when the state was more restrictive about what localities could do. But again, those restrictions were repealed in 2011. So now the city might want to consider doing away with that net worth limitation. Our third recommendation is really short and sweet. We noticed a little inconsistency between different provisions of the city code as it relates to RETR. In section 30-98, it outlines the criteria for the program and lists the maximum income as $50,000 per year. But then there's a table in section 30-101 that shows how to calculate the benefit for the program. And that uses a maximum income of $55,000 per year. Guidance from the city also uses that higher number. And so here, we just very simply recommend amending the ordinance so the limit is described consistently to avoid any confusion or problems down the road.
Our fourth recommendation is to consider implementing a property tax deferral program So just as some background, deferrals allow homeowners who might be on a fixed income to wait until they sell their home or pass away to pay off their property taxes. The deferral authority for the general population of homeowners is very limited. Virginia Code 58.1-3291, which authorizes deferrals for the elderly, disabled, or any homeowner, defers only the amount of tax that exceeds the prior year's portion by more than 5%. However, for low and moderate income homeowners, the city would not face the same restriction on the portion of taxes that they could defer. The city could set that amount themselves. Our fifth recommendation is that Charlottesville increase its communications about programming and streamline some of their postings. As Maggie mentioned, there are some inconsistencies across different websites about what programs are available or what the income caps are. And applications are hosted on several different websites. So Charlottesville could increase the outreach it does on available programs and make it easier for homeowners and taxpayers to identify which credit or program they're available for and can apply to. As Maggie mentioned, these initial proposals were our shorter term proposals, and then our last two are medium and long term, meaning that they might take some more time and effort from the city to implement. So this proposal is a little tricky, and there are two parts to it. Charlottesville currently participates in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or was formerly known as Section 8. And separately, there's a provision in the state code that allows landlords to apply for a tax credit if you participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So Charlottesville as a city does participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. However, even though they do, they are not included in the list of localities in the state code in which landlords can then apply for this community of opportunity tax credit. So Charlottesville could work with the General Assembly to modify the list of covered localities in the state code to include Charlottesville. And the advantage of this change is that it wouldn't require the city to alter their current voucher program in order for landlords to be eligible. Because landlords are already participating in this, all it would take is updating the state code to include Charlottesville in that list of localities. Our last recommendation, and this is our longest term recommendation, is working to amend the state constitution. So we had the chance to talk with Dick Howard, who is one of the drafters of the Constitution in 1972. And we discussed with him the purpose of including the restriction in the Constitution on property tax exemptions. And he shared with us that the original idea behind it was protecting cities from a flood of exemption requests that might undermine their local revenue. And when they initially wrote the Constitution, the drafters attempted to find a way to do without the list of exemptions for the elderly or disabled, or to expand it. But trying to expand it got too complicated. So in his words, they eventually threw up their hands and walked away from it and kind of just left it as is. So we think it might be worth revisiting now if Charlottesville is interested in pursuing making a change in it to allow localities to have greater authority over which exemptions they grant or don't. So that concludes our background and our recommendations. This slide contains a list of the 7 recommendations we've discussed so far. And now we have time to take any questions you all have for us.
Thank you very much. Questions, counselors?
Not right this second, but thank you so much. This is a lot of really good information.
So I just want to be clear. So you're saying that we could raise the RETR limits to $90,000 right away. There's no bar to us doing that. Is that correct?
Yes. Scott, I don't know if you can, well, I guess you've stopped sharing the presentation, but correct. There's no limit.
Okay, so if we were to do that, I mean, obviously we have to check on things with the Commissioner of the Revenue to see what that affects. I know that one of the concerns that we had expressed when the large number of reassessments came this year was that between the reassessments, putting a lot of houses over our current $375,000 limit, a lot of people having net worth issues and a lot of people having income issues, that the number of households that could actually receive some amount of tax relief was dropping precipitously and dropping, frankly, every year. And so if we do in fact have the authority to eliminate some of those some of those limitations, that could be very helpful to a lot of people.
I believe that most of the reasons it has been dropping is not because of the RETR, but because of the assessed value,
Which is affecting the CHAP program.
which is affecting both programs.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the assessed value affects the program that is the homeowner.
Right.
A question just to clarify, so when it comes to amending the CHAPS home value limitation, would that be possible if the change is made to have that program administered by the Social Services Board, and that's what would trigger us having the authority to change or remove the home value limitation, or can that even be done without it being administered by the Social Services Board?
I think that's a question that our resource raises and might be best answered by the city attorney.
Okay.
Did you find some authority for the proposition that we can use the social services angle to be able to do this kind of tax relief?
Yes, so there is an attorney general's opinion that interprets that. So the social services provision that we highlighted has been recodified since the time of this attorney general provision. So the AG opinion is from the 70s, and it's interpreting the forerunner of the current provision. However, it looks at specifically Alexandria was asking if they could conduct a rental relief program and if that would violate some of the limitations on property tax exemptions. And the attorney general said, it's not about property tax exemptions, you can do it under this social services provision. And we felt that that was still, we hadn't found anything subsequent to that would indicate that that opinion was no longer a valid interpretation of that section of the code.
And as lawyers and law students may realize, but others may not, when an attorney general's opinion has been around for a long time and the statute that it applies has been amended and not changing the attorney general's opinion, that acts as kind of a reaffirmation that the attorney general's opinion is worthy of respect even 50 years later.
Well said.
So.
On the, I guess final comment I would have is I definitely would agree that all of these are worth pursuing, as others had mentioned, because, we had plenty of discussions this year about how, despite us expanding the programs, the people participating kept falling each year. So I think these would be particularly important to pursue, and my only thought would be how we can do an analysis to ensure that any changes we make are as progressive as possible, because I think there's clearly room to amend the home value limitations and make some of these other changes, but I also want us to be careful to not end up in a position analogous to, say, California, when they froze property tax rates and it ended up having a quite regressive impact on the state overall, and ended up being a structural advantage to wealthier homeowners in reducing the amount of money available to localities. And so I think there's plenty of room for us to expand without doing that. I just want to make sure that, we're doing as much analysis as we can to ensure that there's not that unintended impact.
Okay.
Yes, I'm very grateful for your presentation and for the packet information. I'm going to spend more time looking through it, and I hope I could get a copy of the PowerPoint as well. And I'm grateful for your work on this.
So if you could help us out with giving us that, since although it's very hard for us to write notes on the computer, I appreciate it. Any other questions or comments? Thank you so much. This has really been very helpful, and it's stimulated in my mind. Of course, I've been working with you on this for a couple of weeks here. It's really stimulated in my mind a lot of ideas about, okay, what could we do for next year? And when we're going to get concerned, we are concerned already, but haven't been able to figure out what we could do about the fact that basically every tax that localities are allowed to impose in Virginia is a regressive tax. And this is the first time that I've seen any suggestion that we may have a way that we might craft a more progressive way to administer real estate taxes. So, thank you all so much. Tell
Thank you
Professor
very
Block
much.
he needs to give you an A.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Good luck.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Social services angle is very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, next item on the agenda is a climate action discussion, and how are we activating that? There are some climate people on the screen. I recognize them.
Good afternoon. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to start with a few comments, opening comments, and then hand it over to Susan Elliott. And then we'll have time for questions at the end, if that works for you.
And if you could simply, I know who you are, but can you identify yourself for everybody in the audience?
Yes, certainly. So my name is Crystal Rittervold. I'm the Environmental Sustainability and Facilities Development Manager in the city of Charlottesville here. Good afternoon, Mayor Snook and councilors. Thank you for inviting us here today to talk about the Climate Protection Program and specifically about the climate plans that are in the works. I'm joined by Stacy Smalls, our Public Works Director, and Susan Elliott here, our Climate Protection Program Manager, who will be sharing the bulk of today's presentation. But my goal in the next few minutes is to set the stage to provide a little context and a little content to kick us off. The city of Charlottesville has had an active climate program since 2007, when it committed to reducing community-wide greenhouse gas emissions by joining the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. 10 years later, in 2017, Charlottesville reaffirmed its commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for climate change by joining the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. The Global Covenant addresses both greenhouse gas reductions, often referred to as climate action or mitigation, as well as adaptation, which is related to the resilience and responding to the effects of climate change. We use the terms climate action to be the umbrella for both of these areas of focus. In 2019, Charlottesville adopted a community-wide goal of 45% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. We initially launched the Climate Action Plan development effort in the fall of 2020, but subsequently encountered several stumbling blocks. There were competing priorities and efforts, including the completion of a comprehensive plan where the topic of climate is one of the 5 guiding principles, as well as one of the 6 priority areas. Leadership and key staff changes, plus ongoing COVID. These last 2 not only derailed important elements of the original process, but also resulted in some key city staff who would have been able to support this action planning work, serving in multiple roles or not being here anymore. I, for example, have been serving not only as the Environmental Sustainability Manager, but also since mid-2018 as Facilities Development Manager, and have been pulled into a variety of COVID-related roles and responsibilities. We also experienced a significant delay in being able to recruit for our climate program specialist position, which I am thrilled is posted right now. So if you know someone who wants to work on this with us, that position closes on the 29th. This added capacity will help us make progress on both the planning and the action side of the program. We are well aware of the expectations, frustrations, and disappointment in the community shared by some of you on council about the lack of and the delay in having a climate action plan, and we share some of them with you. We are ahead of many communities in setting progressive and science-based climate goals that inform our program activity. And we have been tracking emissions data for over a dozen years, so we can see and we can share where we are relative to these goals. That said, we are behind some communities in having an adopted plan that guides priority setting, process and policy setting, resource allocation, and other key decisions. What we are looking at now is a reboot, a focused effort to bring this process back on the rails and to get on the same page. This afternoon, we will provide you with an update of what we've done, what we are doing, and what we are going to do. It will include a preview, a preliminary summary of Charlottesville's Climate Action Plan content, its topics and strategies. There are many which are to be expected and which are included in the climate action plans of peer and neighboring communities, as well as in the most recent IPCC report that was released earlier this month, and which points at the need for transformative actions across sectors, including energy, transportation, food, forests, and much more. There are also some complex, complicated, and some might say big, hairy, audacious ones to be considered. We understand that there are expectations and assumptions around many of these, and that some critical discussions have been deferred to this climate action planning process, such as transit and public transportation electrification or other alternate fueling technology, the future of our municipal gas utility, land use and associated density and zoning. There's a lot of work to be done between now and the point at which Council will have the opportunity to adopt a Charlottesville Climate Action Plan to deliver on the goals of 45% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. We have a lot of blanks to fill in. And when we do have a plan, we will have strategies and key actions identified within core sectors that will guide our efforts and focus areas as we move towards 2030 and beyond. We need to ensure that it has assessment points, mechanisms for evaluating effectiveness, and the flexibility to incorporate and adjust to new information, opportunities, and technologies. I want to thank you in advance for indulging us as we present in rapid fire mode an update on the action that we have continued to move forward, programs, projects, and other efforts, despite not having a document called a Climate Action Plan, and then the subsequent Climate Adaptation Plan. We appreciate our climate advocacy friends and service providers in the community who have been persistent and consistent in not letting us forget the critical nature and urgency of climate action. As we move forward, I want to thank you in the community for your patience and your input on this process. That input will continue to be critical. We are committed to get there, and we are committed to get there with your support. So with that, I'd like to wish you a happy early Earth Day and turn this presentation over to Susan Elliott.
Thank you, Ms. Rittervold.
All right. Crystal, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide deck? Perfect.
Yep.
Excellent. Great. And then, all right. So for today's presentation, we're going to talk through what our current and ongoing activities are, basically reviewing what we have done, what we are doing, and then moving into talking about where we are within our climate planning process, presenting for you some preliminary content that we have put together so far, and then ending on what we have of upcoming activities of what we are going to be doing. For our current and ongoing activities, as Crystal said, our climate program was started back in 2006 with the commitment to the U.S. with the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Program, with commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions community-wide. That commitment was then reaffirmed in 2017 with the city's commitment to the Global Covenant of Mayors. The city's climate program works in a number of ways to support our emission reductions, including delivery to our community of programs and services, funding, community engagement, policy recommendations, and tracking what best practices and peer communities are doing. When we joined the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, the focus of the climate program grew to include some additional steps which are shown on the screen, and also to add a focus of climate adaptation. These new elements were added to the program in addition to the program activities that we already had. The Global Covenant of Mayors commitment outlines a 3-year timeline for completion of all of these steps. There is no penalty if the community needs to take more time to complete those, and it was acknowledged when we joined the Covenant of Mayors that we would need to extend our timeline in order to match available resources and capacity within our organization. Over the first 2 years of the Covenant of Commitment, we completed those first 2 steps on the climate action, greenhouse gas reduction portion of the commitment. When we adopted our new target, we had a new baseline of 2011. And so we had to also, in addition to updating our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, We also had to go back and update our 2011 inventory so that could be in compliance with the reporting standards. We were supposed to begin community engagement for creating a climate action plan in the spring of 2020, which was disrupted as many things were by the emergence of COVID-19. Activities to develop that plan have been start-stop over the last 2 years as different organizational and pandemic conditions have shifted. We're now in a place of greater stability, and we're very excited that we can begin moving forward with renewed momentum to bring the development of this plan to conclusion. As we look forward at the climate adaptation planning side of the process, we began this in the fall of 2021, which is approximately when we had originally intended to start the climate adaptation planning piece. We've completed the climate hazards, or identifying our climate hazards, and we are in the midst of doing the climate vulnerability assessment. That process will conclude this summer, and we are aiming for the next phase, the development of the adaptation plan, to be completed next year. In parallel with these planning activities on these two tracks, we are also still delivering a program aimed at supporting and achieving greenhouse gas emissions across our community. What we see when we look at our emissions community-wide is that approximately 95% of emissions are coming from the community outside of our local government control, and about 5% are from our municipal operations. Digging into that a little bit deeper, we see that 90% of our emissions come from three main sectors: our residential sector, our commercial sector, and our transportation. How we go about supporting our community and supporting our organization and reducing emissions are informed by a number of sources. I put on the screen a list of many of the things that inform what we end up choosing as our activities, where we focus our efforts, and how we go about working with the community and other partners to then end up producing and supporting action within our community. All of this comes together where we have the aim of intending to increase the availability, affordability, accessibility, and awareness of programs, resources, and services that support climate action and bring benefits to our community. To accomplish this, we often work through community partners, expanding on and deepening what their work is within Charlottesville to support our greater community goals. We found this to be a very good, practical model with win-win results. This includes supporting and funding energy efficiency improvements, including hundreds of home energy assessments annually, helping to fund gap fill measures so that our low-income households are eligible for as many utility-funded programs as possible, providing energy smart home rebates, the Commercial and Clean Energy Loan Fund, working to expand the participation within our homes and businesses in the Solarize Charlottesville campaign, and then supporting further engagement programs to be able to reach more of our city homes, our city businesses, and also reaching our students to be able to enable them to understand how their actions connect to climate, and then what sort of options they have for taking action in their own individual lives and daily activities. This year as well, we've added a targeted outreach initiative, which is aimed at reaching the parts of our community who are eligible for state and utility-funded programs that offer up to thousands of dollars of home energy improvement. And that funding comes with no strings attached. But I think if you walk up to anyone on the street and you say, hey, we've got a great deal for you, we've got thousands of dollars on your home, no strings attached, you don't have to really do anything, you don't owe anyone anything, people are gonna look at you pretty skeptically. And so while these are great programs that are out there that are being funded by sources that are not our local government, what we saw as the challenge is that people didn't know about the programs and they didn't know if they could trust them. And so this effort is really aimed at trying to connect our community with these resources to really bring that benefit home. In addition to working with our community partners, we've also provide resources and resource development. A couple of examples of this are the composting programs that the city provides, and also the Urban Heat Island data collection campaign from this past summer. In terms of informing policy, we do that at both the state level, such as participating in the state's recent building code update cycle, as well as at our local city level in being part of the comprehensive plan, zoning, and the development of a standards and design manual. We support other city-led programs and efforts, and we participate in regional coordination community engagement. One example of that is as part of our Climate Action Together umbrella, where we work with the climate sustainability programs at UVA and the County of Albemarle. We offered the January 20th Climate Vulnerability event which had close to 200 community members in attendance during it. Within our own municipal footprint, we are also supporting various types of actions to reduce the emissions that we as an organization are providing. I've listed a sample of these on the slide, two that I wanted to draw attention to. The top one, the Energy Savings Performance Contract. This has the potential for sizable emission reductions within our facilities, and we are in the technical audit stage of that. Additionally, with the Transit Alternative Fuels study that CAT is bringing forward, we are working with CAT to have an inclusion of a climate addendum so that the full impact as CAT is looking at the transition to CNG and battery electric vehicles, we can then see how those impacts come through on our emission profile. And when we look at all these things together, what we're seeing in terms of emissions outcomes is that since 2011, we've had a 30% reduction community-wide. That 30% reduction is a result of combined action at our local, state, federal level, as well as actions that are made by utilities, the markets, and industry as a whole. This 30% does put us on track to achieving our emission reduction goals of 45% by 2030, which is really great to see, but there is also still a lot of work left to be accomplished. And at this, it's a good place in which to look at transitioning over into talking about our climate action planning and how we're going to proceed towards 2050. As I said before, we are in the middle of two different planning processes. One that is aimed at greenhouse gas emission reduction, the other is aimed at climate adaptation. For adaptation, we've had workshops and input opportunities in the fall, and we have a survey that will be coming out this week, and there will also be workshops in June. For climate action planning, which is the main focus for today, we have completed city council briefings, community workshops, facilitated community stakeholder sessions, climate liaison committee meetings, and internal city briefings. What we have to be completed is within this week, today's work session, there is a second survey that is going to be aimed at greenhouse gas emission reduction that will be coming out along with the climate vulnerability survey. In addition to those, looking down the road a little bit further, we anticipate having a town hall, more staff and public engagement, drafting a plan, getting feedback on that from the from the community, bringing that also to the Planning Commission and City Council, incorporating revision, and then being able to bring forward a final proposed plan. At this point, I'm also going to put a plug in for anyone who's watching. If you want to stay updated as these different pieces come forward, or you just want updates about any of the other announcements we have from our programs, new campaign initiatives, any of that, please sign up for our climate action news flashes. We are publicizing these pieces through that. You can sign up at charlottesville.gov/notify me. You'll need to go down to the news flash section and then select climate action to get those notifications. In addition to the community engagement pieces, other things do inform a climate action plan. This is a sample of the types of things that we are bringing into our plan to inform what we're focusing on, where we're looking at the strategies, and then what types of actions and commitments and community values we need to be addressing. What you see on this slide may look a little bit familiar because it largely aligns with the same things that we've been using to inform our program efforts and what we've been doing to help our community already reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Following from the Global Covenant of Mayors commitment, one of the things that first and foremost our plan needs to make sure it is targeted at is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And so in looking at that, at these main three sectors, along with waste, that is where our emissions are coming from, what we know within our plan is we have to have our strategies aimed at the types of activity that are producing these emissions and also what the primary source of those carbon factors are for those. Adding on to this, we also have to keep in mind what is the level of action and investment that is needed in order to really make progress to achieve our goals. And looking at these three scenarios on the left, which have been shared in previous community meetings, and the current unfunded budget request, we can see pretty clearly that success will require action from the community as well as from government, that we cannot rely solely upon existing utility and cleaner grid commitments, and that we need to be aiming action at multiple sectors and multiple types of strategies, looking at a combination of building energy improvements, on-site renewables, and transportation mode and fuel shifts. I'm going to do a brief pause at this point. The next section of the presentation will start to dive into the preliminary plan content, followed by what you can expect to see coming up. But at this point, I did want to put a brief pause in case there are questions from council on what we've been doing and where we've gotten so far within our process.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Fire away.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation so far. I guess one question I have is when you look at the chart that had the 95 and then 5% is the municipal, the target of this, the goal of this is for the entire city, not just for the municipal components, correct?
That is correct. It's about that full 100% combined and then reducing that.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess, as a project manager, what I try to do is if there's already a good plan out there, if there's already something that's working, there's some times in which plagiarism is perhaps not the right word, but finding the best plan that's out there that's sort of already doing what we want to do and filling in our data to sort of make it ours. I see that you're working with the university and with the county, which I appreciate. I know the university's been doing a lot of work on this for many years. They're very fortunate to have a boatload of staff to help them with this, which I know we've not had. But it's definitely my hope that whatever we're doing, as much as possible, we're trying to not only be aligned with our neighbors, but if there are things that they're doing already that we can just reapply, I hope that is part of what's happening in your process.
Yes, it is. So we are looking at UVA's, how their activities are. We're looking at Albemarle County's plan. In addition to that, we have a handful of other plans from peer communities, both within the Commonwealth and across the country, that we're also looking at.
Okay, and I guess you'll perhaps say a little more about this at the end, but in terms of the staffing needs, the staffing that you mentioned at the outset, the need for more bandwidth organizationally, you're currently recruiting for that person or persons?
That's
We
correct.
have one position that was approved in the FY22 budget that will, double our dedicated staff capacity.
Sure.
And there's a reality that the work of pursuing or implementing components of a plan like this will happen with other city departments taking the lead. So if we look at it as a citywide plan, and then clearly the lead can be taken by the private sector or the community on a number of the strategies. This is, I would submit, not fully government controlled in terms of success and implementation.
Understood. And I think I had heard that there was a notion of putting this group, sort of the action group or whatever you want to call it, within the city manager's office. Am I correct in that?
I think there's been some discussions, but I think that would certainly warrant further
Okay.
coordination and discussions with our senior management.
Okay, maybe I just dreamed that. And then I guess the other piece was, the other question I had was in terms of the work we're doing with our facilities. I saw in one of your slides that I don't know if you're bringing in a contractor or whatever to help with that. I'm assuming that's including like retro commissioning to go through and retro commission our HVAC systems, to do whatever we can to make them as energy efficient as possible. Can you speak a little more to the audits that you're doing?
Sure. We recently are using a program provided by the Virginia Department of Energy, which used to be the Departments of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. They have a program for energy savings performance contracting that public bodies can use.
Okay.
And we used they have pre-qualified energy services company. We went through an RFP process. We selected a firm, CMTA. They're
Okay.
currently doing the technical energy audits of about 40 buildings that include school buildings. This summer, we'll be getting reports from those audits, and essentially that will be a menu of efficiency and conservation and improvement opportunities. And we will then need to go through those and determine what size and scale of projects we have financial and appetite for.
Yeah, I think that'll be very informative. I'm really glad to hear that y'all are doing that. So I'm assuming that's everything from whether your fixtures have got in your bathrooms automatic flushing or whatever, to LED lights, to the envelopes of the buildings. I'm assuming that'll be a very comprehensive analysis of all city properties. Is that the idea?
That is the idea, and we'll also be looking at some of the real updated solar opportunities.
Okay. And does all of this work have connection with what the utilities departments are doing? I mean, what is the sort of linkage there in terms of new project work?
I'm not sure I understand exactly the question, but if we identify opportunities and there are other stakeholders outside of sort of our energy team,
Okay.
we'll certainly need to be coordinating with them along the way.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of like efficiencies with our water production systems. I mean, I guess that's done with Urbana, but
Yeah,
efficiencies.
that's outside of the scope of this project.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And
So
just,
those great questions. Thank you.
and just remember, when you borrow from one person, it's plagiarism. When you borrow from two people, it's research.
There you go. I like that.
I have a couple of quick questions. When as we're doing this, looking at all the buildings that we own and the municipal buildings, including the schools, is this also including all the buildings that we rent out to others?
We are particularly looking at the ones where the city or the schools are paying the utility bills, because the way this model works is the savings from those projects help finance the work. And so if it's rented out and someone else is paying the bills, those are not the simplest ones to address in this model. But I think we're going to learn a lot, and we are not limited by this contract to do efficiency work in other facilities.
We do have a number of city-owned buildings that we don't really collect any rent for. So I was just wondering if, where we collect a minimal amount of rent, that the savings of that actually might count. So I was just wondering if those buildings are also included in this.
Yeah, at the moment we have identified, and again, we had to put a little bit of a manageable size and shape around this effort. So they are the school buildings, all the CCS buildings, the city buildings owned and operated and occupied by city functions. And we're also looking at some of the jointly owned buildings, but again, that's a little bit of a different portfolio because of the ownership and cost sharing around that.
Okay.
Probably the simple answer is we're probably not including all of the facilities that you're asking about.
Okay, I'm just kind of, we get very siloed sometimes, and I understand that we do that a lot of the times so that we can actually control a project and actually get it done. But I always want to bring us back to the awareness of the whole picture that we own. And in the climate action planning process, are we looking at how we can, I know only 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from our municipal buildings. So I'm hoping that part of this process is also going to help inform us as we are putting money into climate action and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions across the city, that will help inform us of the areas that we can target funds as grants or as nonprofits or something like buses and transportation, where we can get the most bang for our buck, as far as reducing the most greenhouse gas emissions we can.
Yes, and what you're pointing out, there will be some more content coming out in this presentation that will help you kind of see where we're looking at with that. So our municipal footprint is informed by the energy our buildings use, the energy used for our streetlights and traffic signals, and then for any of our mobile or transportation assets. And so one of the things is we do have more operational control over all of those pieces within our organization. So we are able to actually go a little bit deeper or more targeted with our strategies and look at where do we need to be focused, what will give us those biggest changes. But then we can go that extra little layer in terms of starting to also look at, are there sort of process improvements? Are there things within our institutional policies? Like what can we do to really ensure near-term changes, but also set that stage for ongoing?
Okay. I just have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm just curious, if you're looking at HVAC issues, there are a lot of things, I now will just sort of throw out that I have a little bit of knowledge here and only a little bit of knowledge, but I know that an awful lot of HVAC issues have been able to be addressed using CARES Act, ARP Act kinds of funding. Is there anything like that your review of HVAC systems might enable us to be able to finance with somebody else's money?
There's a possibility. I think a lot of the work that's been done to date was specifically to do COVID mitigation and not so much prioritizing energy efficiency. Coming out of this technical energy audit, the focus will be how those systems perform and do the COVID mitigation, but also where there may be efficiency opportunities. And yes, I would like to also expect there to be some funding or funds that come available from federal and state sources to do actual investments in our infrastructure.
Okay. In the 2016 greenhouse gas emission inventory, the document included numbers for energy consumption and emissions for municipal uses, breaking out energy use in municipal buildings and driving municipal vehicles. For some reason, those numbers don't appear in the actual Excel spreadsheets on the city website showing the data for 2016 through 2019, the CSV files that are at the bottom of one of the pages. Is there some reason for that? Some reason why those spreadsheets don't include data on municipal emissions?
Yeah, so where we use a software called ClearPath that's provided to us through our membership in ICLEI, and there's a series of different types of reports that we can do exports with. To try to put the data out there simply, we selected one of those reports, and that's what we then uploaded onto the website. We can go back and look at the municipal side of it. One of the pieces in terms of methodology updates that has happened is that when we look at the type of data that's used to calculate emissions on our community level, we are not able to clearly identify what within there is from our municipal vehicles and what is not. And so the fleet portion of our municipal emissions is something that we can calculate because we have access to the data of our actual fuel usage. But if we put that all into one big pie chart, instead of representing 100%, it's going to represent more than 100%. But because we can't tell you how much of the community transportation includes the emissions from our fleet fuel, we can't tell you how much of an overlap there is. So to add the municipal data onto the website, it would make more sense actually to do a completely separate data set that is just the municipal data. And we can do that. No one has asked us to do that yet, but that is something that we can put out there.
I mean, just in terms of what we can control directly, we have much greater likelihood of controlling directly a municipal use than we do trying to influence a non-municipal use. And so it would be useful to know if there are things that we can change. And maybe we get to a certain nut that we can't get any smaller than, but I'd at least like to know that. So I was also struck by one other thing during the earlier presentation. The 2016 report, and you quoted this, talked about phase 2 would include setting a greenhouse gas reduction target, which we did back in July of 2019, and assessing climate vulnerabilities. And I'm not sure that I know what that would mean. What does it mean to be assessing climate vulnerabilities? I don't think we've done it, whatever it is. Can you explain that phrase to me?
Yeah, I can try to provide a bit of explanation on that. So assessing a climate vulnerability, we're in the middle of that process right now. We had some workshops in the fall. We're going to be releasing a survey to get more community input, and then there'll be a second round of workshops in June that will help put all that together. What assessing climate vulnerability is that you start by identifying what your hazards are. So the top 3 climate hazards for Charlottesville are extreme heat, increased intensity of precipitation and flooding, and then changing seasonal conditions. After you recognize what those are that are your hazards, you then go through a process of understanding what is the risk from those, both in terms of what is the level of impact and what is the level of exposure. So for example, if you have for extreme heat, you may have outdoor workers have higher levels of exposure. Whereas people who have certain health conditions, people who are younger and then older, they are more at risk in terms of when they're experiencing extreme heat. Biologically, their health system, their physical health ends up being affected more than somebody who is not in the same population subgroups to how they respond to extreme heat. And so it's a process of working both with staff and also with the community in terms of trying to understand where is that risk from where are there exposures that that people will be experiencing those climate hazards, but also then what is that potential level of impact from it. Where that feeds into is then identifying what are the things that we then need to be targeting our climate adaptation strategies out at, recognizing that we're going to be experiencing these effects. Where do we have these vulnerabilities in our community that we then need to look at? How do we either proactively address to reduce that exposure, that potential impact, or what do we do in terms of looking at our response systems to once an event happens?
I mean, I'm curious in particular, today we had snow and sleet in Charlottesville on April 18th. Of course, that is an indication of weather rather than climate. But it tells us in the sort of the big picture that something's going on out there. I guess I'm wondering whether you will be able to figure out a way to quantify or to measure those assessed climate vulnerabilities. Is that quantifiable, or is it just one of these things where you say, okay, it's happening, folks, get used to it?
So in terms of what is projected of, for example, how many heat waves we would have in the course of a year or how long each of those heat waves would go, there are the climate projection models, and that's part of identifying what the climate hazards are. When you get over to the vulnerabilities, it ends up being a gradient of least impactful up to having the greatest risk with the greatest vulnerability impacts on them. And then that gradient is part of what will be coming out after the June workshops, and when we have all the community input and all the staff input of what that looks like. We can definitely bring more of that information back to you, and I can offer some examples from some other communities of what these vulnerability assessments end up looking like. I don't have anything readily available to pop on a slide right now, though, for you.
That's right. Today is just an early phase of the process, I know. As I was looking at the data from the past reports, it looks like our CO2 equivalent emissions in 2019 were about 320,000 million metric tons, if I've got the units correct, about 30% off of the same number for 2011. For us to get to a 45% reduction, we'd have to get down to about 250,000. The good news seems to be that we're 2/3 of the way to the goal. The bad news is that most of the improvement seems to have come from Dominion Power having a lower carbon footprint in the energy that they're providing to us, rather than because we in the city have particularly done anything. Is that a fair reading of the situation?
I would have to dig into more of the data, going back into the activity data. We do see in the data, especially when you think about growth that the city's experienced since 2011, we have seen the improvements, or at least lack of increase in terms of the energy that we're consuming with it. Since 2011, Dominion has made quite a significant number of changes of its fuel sources that it's been using to generate electricity. When you look at across our residential and commercial sector, about 2/3 of the energy that's powering those buildings is coming from electricity. So when Dominion in the past made the change of switching from coal to natural gas-fired plants, and now that it's moving forward with adding more renewables and clean energy and reducing its reliance on natural gas, we are seeing all of those benefits come in. One of the things that we saw back in 2016, and I think it still holds true today, I haven't double checked it for every inventory year, is that we're seeing an increase overall in our community of energy, the amount of energy that's being consumed, but the overall emissions are actually going down. So that means where we're getting our sources of emissions, how effectively we're using energy overall, including our growth, to end up doing all the activities that we do on a daily basis. We're using less carbon per energy unit overall.
I mean,
And absolutely we are within, having Dominion be our primary or the only electric utility source that we have. What they choose to do in their energy generation has a very strong impact on what we end up realizing here.
I mean, the numbers, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I got around to playing around with some of these things as I was sort of diving more deeply. And it appears as though the change in efficiency, or I'm trying to figure out the best way to characterize it, or more accurately, probably the decline in emissions per unit of energy in electricity seems to have been about a 20% decline over the last 3 years, between 2016 and 2019. The changes in gas and other such things relatively, I mean, almost exactly the same, but certainly in electricity, it seems there are about 20% fewer emissions per kilowatt hour in 2019 as opposed to 2016. That's really all the questions I've got. Well, certainly plenty of questions as we go through the process, but I know we'll be talking to you again. Is there a second phase?
Yeah, I was going to say, if I could respectfully request, there's another second part to this presentation that I think also is going to address a number of what council was hoping to hear today.
Great.
If you all are good with us moving on.
Please.
Excellent. And could I also get a sense of a time check? I heard earlier that you're not planning on doing a closed session today.
Correct.
But I do want to be respectful of your all's time and when you were expecting for this portion to wrap up. Are you still aiming before 5:30 or what?
No, 5:30 is not a magic time now. 5:45-ish would be fine, gives us a chance to get a break before the next part of the meeting. Does that work for y'all?
Excellent. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, so moving on, the next section that we're going to dive into is sharing with you all preliminary content that we put forward for what will be in the Climate Action Plan. This is not a kind of, soup to nuts, top to bottom, going through every single section that we're envisioning. We will share an outline of what we anticipate being all the different sections, kind of like a table of content for the report, and then also a sample of what we're anticipating will be in each of the sector chapters. This next section of the presentation is sharing with you all what we're anticipating for the key strategies and key actions that associate with each of the sectors that we're looking at. After going through this, we will then speak about what are upcoming next steps that you can expect to see, and then that will be the end, and we can come back for more questions on the second half of the presentation.
Great.
All right, so for this is where we are within the planning process based on what we've been brought together. We would love to have a full draft plan to share today. That's not where we are. As I went over before, there are still a number of different engagement and synthesizing different pieces of input to wrap into what this overall plan ends up including. But what we have today captures where we are and what we plan to be building on as we move forward into developing a document that would be a draft plan. So starting off looking at our buildings and energy sector, this represents about 60% of Charlottesville's emissions profile. The emissions from this come from the energy that's used to power our buildings, keep us comfortable, power all of our devices, all of those sort of activities. The primary fuel sources for this are electricity and natural gas. I'm not going to read all the different words on the screen, but I will go through each of the strategies as we go through these slides. So the first strategy is looking at moving new construction items to get closer to net zero, looking both at energy efficiency, on-site renewables, and looking at solar-ready building standards. Pairing with that is looking at increasing the energy efficiency and on-site renewables for existing buildings. looking at supporting the increased energy efficiency and renewable energy through providing through innovative financing mechanisms that look at enabling and leveraging use of private action and investment, and then supporting the transition to a carbon-free sources and carbon neutrality for building energy supply. Within the transportation sector, which represents about 30% of Charlottesville's emissions profile, greenhouse gas emissions come from the fuels that are used to power our automotive vehicles as we're going around town. The primary fuel sources for this are gasoline and diesel. In terms of strategies, we're looking at increasing travel by walking, biking, and transit, also can be referred to as mode shift. Looking at supporting the use of high efficiency vehicles, developing a community electric vehicle charging network. We do have a high percentage of renters, we have a high percentage of commuters and also visitors to our area. So assuming that people have the ability to charge at home or to make that decision about installing home charging equipment is not something that we really can expect for the majority of our residents. And then the strategy of encouraging alternative transportation behaviors. Looking over at our waste sector, this represents about 5% of Charlottesville's emission profile. Waste emissions come from organics that are decomposing in the landfill. Primary sources of organics are yard waste, food waste, and then some paper and packaging materials. In terms of strategies to address this is applying a sustainable materials management approach to Charlottesville's waste system, diverting organics from the landfill, and then reducing the amount of food and other organics-based materials that then become waste that have to be processed in some manner. Pairing with all this is also looking over at our natural resources. With emissions, there's what we're putting up into the air, and then there's what we have the ability to take out of the air. In terms of our natural resources, particularly in regards to trees, these benefit on both the emission reduction side and also in helping to address our climate adaptation and resilience side. This portion of the plan and what we're talking about on these slides is really aimed at those emissions reductions pieces. The adaptation and resilience part will be coming following the results of our climate vulnerability assessment, and that part of the planning on adaptation will be next year. We do intend to have the two plans speak to each other, and that's part of what you're going to be seeing on here is that some of the strategies around natural resources will appear in both of those plans together. So in terms of natural resources, maintaining a robust urban forest on city-owned land, looking then also at the privately owned properties and encouraging healthy increased tree canopy there, and recognizing that there's not always a good opportunity to use trees, and so wanting to understand also what are these non-tree canopy actions that support emission reduction, looking at things from the natural resource angle. We spoke earlier and answered some questions about within our municipal sector. Our municipal sector, it represents about 5% of our overall emissions profile. The emissions come from the energy used to power our government and school buildings, our streetlights, traffic signals, and then also our fuels for our city fleet, transit, school buses, and other mobile assets like our lawnmowers and things like that that go around that use fuel. The primary energy and fuel sources are electricity and natural gas for our buildings and lighting, and then gasoline and diesel for our mobile assets. In terms of looking at strategies for our buildings and energy, looking at reducing energy demand in existing buildings, looking at reducing energy demand for new construction as we do significant redevelopments or brand new buildings, looking at achieving carbon neutrality for electricity use at city facilities by 2030, and then also incorporating internal process adjustments so that we can improve coordination, effectiveness, and collaboration. Looking at converting our streetlights and traffic signals over to LEDs. And then when we start looking at our transportation and mobile asset side, really looking at planning and supporting the transition to zero carbon and carbon neutral fuel sources for our mobile assets. In addition with these sectors, there are a couple of items that still need to be further discussed. We will be bringing all of this forward and getting more feedback and then helping to suss these out further. What I've put on the screen here are things that we don't have content to share with you specifically today as recommendations or preliminary content. These are complex topics with many entwined and interlocked pieces that go beyond just our climate action goals and need to be discussed further with our colleagues and also hearing from the community. We're listing them here to acknowledge their importance, but we are not trying to put forth preliminary content or recommendations at this time. I can, though, and would like to share some comments about what this bigger picture of context is that sits behind these topics. Because Charlottesville owns a gas utility, it opens up more considerations for us to consider than other communities necessarily do when they're going through climate planning. Some of those considerations include comments that were heard during the CVille Plans Together process with requests to limit new natural gas hookups. There's the recent IPCC report, which clearly states that new fossil fuel infrastructure will become stranded assets before 2050. In regards to strategies that reduce demand and activity and emissions that our residents and businesses are putting up into the air, Charlottesville Gas has been an active partner in terms of funding and marketing energy efficiency improvement programs, particularly those for lower income and gas assistance program eligible households. In considering what sort of fuel source alternatives are, there are discussions in the federal and industry level about the use of renewable natural gas and clean hydrogen. Both of these are evolving markets in technology. They are not readily available. There are expectations that these will be expensive. And there are also some predictions that there will be potentially too little supply nationally and regionally, and that what supply there is may need to be directed over towards high intensity industry uses that don't have other alternatives, which means that demand for those will be going up and possibly costs will be going up, or that supply will not be available for uses like in our community. Considerations of expansion expanding gas hookups connects into things in questions such as the limiting hookups for new construction, the affordability of quality of all electric appliances, looking at CAT's transition to and their considerations of alternatives to diesel for their fuel as fuel for their vehicles, such as CNG and then also battery electric. If looking at transitioning from diesel to CNG could represent a significant increase in natural gas use. There's also questions about how do we reach carbon neutrality, both within our city operations, within our transit operations, but also as a provider of natural gas to the community. There's questions about whether or not those, that value of carbon neutrality should or could extend beyond to what we're then providing. Oops, sorry. Forgot that. I didn't mean to skip that on the slides there. And then also when we're looking at the idea of how do we reach carbon neutrality, there are questions about carbon offsets and credits. So to what extent are these valid as strategies? At what scale can we use them? And also at what level of accountability or reliability exists for us to rely on and trust of high quality offsets as part of how we end up reaching our climate plan? And then one other piece is that this plan is meant to be strategic in nature. It is aiming at both getting us to our 2030 goal and setting the stage that we are well on our way towards the what we need to prioritize to reach our 2050 goal. As a plan that's intended to be strategic in nature, we need to include guidelines for implementation that end up reflecting the values and priorities that we've heard from our community, from you all in council, and also as staff as part of this process. And then, so upcoming activities, what can you expect to see from us upcoming over the next several months in moving this process to bring a climate action plan forward? For our climate action plan, milestones that you can expect to see, the first two are this week, followed by the items that I spoke about earlier, with an aim to conclude before the end of 2020. In terms of drafting our plan, looking at a plan outline is on the left. So you can see how we're looking at organizing the plan, the different sectors and types of content that will be included overall in it. And then on the right, an outline of what we'd expect to see of strategies and actions for each chapter. In addition to this, just with our climate program, because we are still delivering program services and activities to help support our community in reducing their emissions while we're also going through these planning processes. We are expecting to have increased staff capacity as of July. There is the climate vulnerability assessment, which we are anticipating having completed before September. The climate action plan, which we have anticipated completion before the end of 2022. And then the climate adaptation plan with anticipated completion in 2023. There is the ongoing delivery of climate action work, which includes the very generous $150,000 that Council approved last week for this coming budget year, as well as bringing updates on our plan progress and other program updates to Council over that time. And so with that, that concludes the presentation. I am putting another plug out there for people to sign up for climate action news flashes, because we really do want people to be able, who want to know what we're doing, to be able to stay in the know. And now we'll open up for more questions and discussion from you all about preliminary content, upcoming activities, and really anything else that you want to talk to us about.
Councilors, other questions?
I have a few quick questions and then a few comments. One is, do you see any opportunities to connect this process with our zoning rewrite process that is going to be underway? I'm thinking particularly when it comes to parking requirements and potentially building code.
Yes, that is one of the pieces, and underneath are the sections for the buildings and energy within our community. Some of the key actions do speak to what we can look in terms of our regulations and where we fit within the zoning piece of that. I think we are regulatorily limited in terms of some of what options we have available, but that is anticipated to be part of it. In terms of timelines, this plan may not be fully adopted by then, but as with other planning processes, the comprehensive plan, other past efforts we've done with zoning, we do have those lines of communication within staff and within our organization to be able to provide content and input.
And yeah, I know, there's a lot of gray areas, but I think some localities in Northern Virginia have been doing a lot with building codes in particular. Another question, is there any coordinated plan or strategy for how to take advantage of the bipartisan infrastructure law? Just because I know basically every single piece of this, there's a program available through that for localities potentially.
I'm happy to
In terms
answer
of
I was going to say as a starter, we're tracking some of the information that's coming out through some of our peer networks, whether it's Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. They've got a grant manager who's trying to help connect some of those upcoming funding opportunities with the various programs and initiatives. I know Council have talked previously about some form of coordinated grant work in the city, and obviously the bipartisan infrastructure law is a very unique example of how that could ensure that we're not competing internally against each other, but also coordinating and not realizing missed opportunities.
And then, I know we're, a little bit behind the 8 ball compared to other localities on Council's end because of a lack of investment in grant coordinators in those staff positions, but there's obviously just billions and billions there that we're not going to get for several decades at least. Again, last question is, what do you see as sort of the internal process for how to develop and finalize this plan, over the next several, months? Is just curious, what that's going to look like, what kind of stakeholders it may include.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the upcoming process, and I think you're asking about both on the community side when you say stakeholders as well as internally with staff. We are going to have the surveys that are coming out, both for the adaptation vulnerability assessment portion, but there will be a separate one specifically focused on informing the greenhouse gas reductions portion. We'll have a town hall, which will be community focused. In terms of working across our departments, we've talked about a couple of different ways of that, of either doing some small group pieces with staffing or even doing an internal staff town hall sort of setup, possibly some combination of that. There are definitely a lot of pieces within this framework that how the city goes about doing its business opens up opportunities or can open up opportunities into the community. And so making sure that we can reach out with the department directors of that, understand what programs and other activities are happening, that we're all rowing in the same direction would be part of it. And as we get more meat on the bones of hearing back from people about like where we are right now, but then as we get closer to a full draft, then bringing that draft out and getting that both for internal and community-focused input is part of it.
And then just some final comments quickly. I do think it'll be very important to try to have, a plan finished in time for it to be incorporated in our next budget cycle.
Yes.
I don't know exactly what, month or time frame that may be, but I think we have to ensure that council is able to fully incorporate this into next year's budget, and be thinking about it in that way explicitly. Would also echo part of what had been mentioned about our natural gas utility. I think it'll be very important for us to think about that, the future of that long term, as well as its potential use as potentially a revenue source for climate programs, or that be some sort of carbon tax or something like that. And those are very complex, long-term, big things, but I think we've got to start diving into that work. I mean, you mentioned the IPCC report, which said, a lot of these are likely to remain stranded assets by 2050. We know that UVA is going to be making some substantial changes on their energy uses, which could connect to our natural gas utility. I just think we've got to start planning and thinking about it now. And the final comment is, I hope we're able to really rely on our community partners outside the city, because that's obviously such a tremendous resource for actually implementing this. I mean, we're one of the sources of renewable energy industry, in the Southeast. I think we've got a lot of nonprofits that want to help with, PPPs or other things related to installing solar panels and other green retrofitting to our municipal buildings. And one final thought is, I know when I was at the National League of Cities conference, there was a presentation, I think, from Fort Collins, Colorado, and a couple other localities. And when it comes to that building side of it, 60% of the emissions coming from residential and commercial, who had set up revolving loan funds for green retrofitting in their community. And I think either next budget cycle, maybe even in December or January when we allocate our surplus, I certainly think that's something we should explore, think about, because that's something that we could seed with one-time money that will, come back to us and be recurring to hit that building side of the issue. But those are all the thoughts I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Payne.
Yeah, I guess I would largely echo what Councilor Payne just mentioned, and I would just urge y'all to be bold. I know that there's been a lot of headwinds over the last years, and I'm grateful for you sticking with it. I understand, I'm an engineer and understand that how COVID safety goes against energy efficiency sometimes in terms of MERV ratings on filters and so forth. But the only reason I bring that up is I realize that the last years have been hard, and sometimes you get conflicting direction. Like, we need to be safe with respect to COVID. At the same time, how do we have the bandwidth organizationally and then actually in doing the work and the kinds of things we do? But I just would encourage you to be bold and push hard. And, I really feel like the end of 22 is too late. I would love to see something by the end of the summer, the first part of the fall. And this is really more directed towards the city manager than the two of you. I know you all are doing the best with what you've got. But if we're going to be able to think carefully about our budget for fiscal year 2024, I guess, we need to go ahead and know what it is y'all want us to prioritize and to be able to fund that. I think about, it's interesting how these things intersect and overlay. For instance, you brought up the point about trees, and I think we put in a little more money for trees this year in the CIP. and it's the Greenbrier Walkway. I was happy to see that on your list. I think that is a great example of something that checks off a bunch of boxes, everything from helping refugee children that live in an apartment complex get to school to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking in those sorts of ways, I appreciate the fact that you're doing that. I would say, and again, I know the kind of work you're involved in is hard work and it's technical work, and you want to be inclusive, but I personally respect your expertise, and I would encourage you to not survey things to death. There's a place and a time for stakeholder engagement, and I know that that's important, but you're also very smart people. And I would encourage you to use your technical expertise to make good, strong recommendations that we can get behind to move forward on. I think that, the notion of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good is really applicable in this case. Relative to the gas utility and that becoming a stranded asset at some point, I offer this just as a suggestion. I'm not the city manager, but I offer this as a suggestion that maybe that is a complicated enough question. All of the pieces involved in it, not just the technical part, but the financial part and the equity part. Maybe it makes sense to have a consultant that does that kind of work, and we just say, look, lay out some options for us of how this might work, and get back with us versus trying to do all that in-house. That's just a suggestion. And then, at the university, they have something called the Delta Force, which is basically it's about reducing the delta in terms of the difference in temperature for chilled water is what it originally got towards in terms of energy savings. But the point is, within facilities management, there's basically a fund that's been set up that helps pay forward investments in lighting and so forth, fixtures, in the sort of retro commissioning that we mentioned about HVAC systems. So if there's something, if y'all need like a fund, a pot of money, I don't know, maybe you already have this, $150,000, $200,000, I can see that with our strategic funds perhaps. Maybe it's a little too late this year due to the budget situation. But anyway, if you need something to be able to sort of fund sustainably work within our buildings to convert our lighting, to do those sorts of things, and thinking in terms of payback. Like if you invest in these LED lights, you're going to save this amount of money over 6 months. And if you can put together a plan like that, I know that we'll find a way to fund it because it's important, it saves money now, and it's for our future. So anyway, I want to thank you for the work that you've done and just encourage you to be bold.
Thank you. I'll keep mine brief. I just want to reiterate, even if the plan is not complete, even just some key spending components by October, November would be really important for us so that we can start allocating funds, and just knowing where the big areas are going to be and some of the best places we could focus, both in our municipal buildings and in our community as a whole, and what we can use to either as seed money or also as matching dollars for various grants coming up. And just, I'm going to echo again, I know my for this has been in the past, and I just want to reiterate that I am still for this, that our climate action group being actually moved into a more holistic capacity, more under this in the city manager's office area, so that it is like equity, looking at every part of our city, because climate affects every part of our city. And greenhouse gas emissions are everywhere. So we need to be looking at it in our zoning plan. We need to be looking at it in our schools, our maintenance, our buildings, our parks departments, everywhere. So thank you very much.
And I guess I have really two two thoughts. One is a very picky one. That is, when I was running around the city knocking on doors 3 years ago, I was talking about the idea of LED streetlights, and somebody said, well, that's all very well and good, but Dominion actually owns a lot of those streetlights. I would like to get at some point some clarity about whether there are restraints like that because of agreements we've got with Dominion or anybody else. I'm not just talking about streetlights in particular, that's just the one that comes immediately to mind. Because it may be that one of the things that needs to happen, maybe there's some agreement that's expiring next year or something like that, that if we don't realize it's expiring next year, we won't do anything about it. So just think a little bit about that kind of thing. The other thing I will add is that I know from talking to a lot of folks or having a lot of folks talk to me that there are a lot of very smart people in this city who believe that they know everything about your job. And they may know a fair amount about your job. And I would like to make sure that we trap their knowledge and their passion and find a way to channel that. And so as you move to, I guess the town hall is the next public engagement phase, if there are ways perhaps to have a committee designated to go look at this issue or that issue, see if some of the people who express an interest on some of these things might be roped in, because I think we would all gain by doing that. The last point is to echo an earlier comment. If there are, in fact, things that we can be putting into the zoning rewrite bill, or the zoning rewrite ordinance, that would make a difference for energy conservation kinds of things, some of them may seem obvious, some of them may not actually be obvious to those of us who are not in the field. And I hope that if there are things that you identify for us that we ought to be paying attention to in the zoning rewrite, please, contact me, contact other counselors, whatever, let us know. Do not assume that we know your job. So, any other questions or comments?
I had one comment I just wanted to throw out for the general awareness. When I started my job, and I think when Susan started her job, it was not clear how critical policy work was going to be, and that a point that you made, Councillor Smook, about so much of the emission reduction being tied to things that are happening in the grid or happening through other forces that are not city decisions or regulations or control. It really does become relevant when Virginia passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and Virginia committed to participating in RGGI, generating tens of millions of dollars for our residents to be able to do that kind of action work in their homes. We're not the only locality. All of our peer localities who are working in climate space and climate programs recognize the importance to be engaged in state policy, federal policy, in order to achieve it, because getting from the 30% to the 45 is likely not going to happen with solely city activities. So it really becomes very important.
Thank you.
And we worked on a legislative packet this year that is incorporating a number of things about building code, about efficiency requirements, about trying to move in that direction, and I think that work is going to continue.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation to us. We'll look forward to the next phase, I guess, is the town hall, and we'll get feedback on that.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all we have on the agenda for the 4 o'clock portion. Any reason we should not recess until 6:30?
None that I could think of.
I got nothing.
All right, we will recess until 6:30. We will come back to a different Zoom link, I understand. Thank you. We're in recess.